throwaway account, because some of the people involved still stalk my LinkedIn like it's a crime scene. So yeah, this happened right after I came back from service. New unit, new building, new faces, same old attitude. On my first day, he didn't even ask my name. He looked at me over his glasses, that slow, practiced look men use when they want you to feel smaller, and said it flat, like he was reading a label on a box. "You're here for coffee and reports. No welcome. No, what's your background? No, glad to have you." Just that. The room went quiet in that very specific way where everyone pretends not to hear because acknowledging it would mean choosing a side. Someone suddenly found their keyboard fascinating. Someone else stared at a wall like it had just told them a secret. I nodded. Not because I agreed. Not because I was intimidated. Because arguing on day one is a rookie mistake. Inside, something clicked. Not anger yet, more like recognition. I've heard that tone before. It's the same tone people use right before they underestimate you in ways that cost them later. He motioned toward an empty desk like he was assigning me a parking spot. "Reports on my desk by 9, coffee without sugar." I almost smiled. Because here's the thing he didn't know. My reports don't need sugar, and they don't land on his desk last. But I didn't say that. I sat down, opened a clean notebook, and started writing, not just numbers, not just tasks, but names, habits, tension points. Who interrupted whom? Who avoided eye contact? Who flinched when equipment hummed a little too loud? You don't survive service by being loud. You survive by noticing. He thought he'd put me in my place. What he actually did was show me exactly who he was. Early, cleanly, and without ambiguity. And honestly, that was generous of him. By the end of the first week, I understood what kind of place this was. The unit was new, freshly assembled, rushed into existence because someone higher up needed results yesterday. New paint on the walls, new equipment that still smelled like plastic and factory grease, screens that hadn't learned their own glitches yet. But the people? The people were old problems in new chairs. You could feel it the moment you walked in. Conversations stopped when certain names were mentioned. Laughter died too quickly. Everyone worked fast, but not confidently, like they were trying to outrun something invisible. Mistakes weren't corrected openly. They were buried, minimized, quietly pushed onto someone lower in the food chain. I recognized it immediately. That tight, shallow breath atmosphere where everyone is afraid of being noticed, but even more afraid of being responsible. He didn't notice any of that. He saw columns, deadlines, a hierarchy he believed was unbreakable. Every morning, like a ritual, he would stand near the glass wall and remind us, "We're not here to play heroes. We're here to follow instructions. Do what you're told, and don't improvise." The way he said, "improvise," made it sound like a disease. People nodded, some too quickly, some without looking up. A few exchanged looks that said, "Just survive the day." I nodded too. Outwardly, I was exactly what he expected. Quiet, efficient, invisible unless spoken to. I delivered reports on time. I brought coffee when asked. I didn't challenge him in meetings. I didn't reference my past. I didn't correct his assumptions. Inwardly, I was doing something else entirely. I was mapping the unit. Who actually knew how the systems worked versus who just knew how to talk about them? Who double-checked safety protocols and who skipped steps when they thought no one was watching? Which equipment logs were filled in properly and which were copied forward week after week without being reviewed? I noticed how often people deferred decisions upward, even when they were capable of handling them. How initiative had been trained out of them, not by rules, but by consequences. Once, during a routine check, I asked a simple question about a backup procedure. Nothing confrontational, just curiosity. The room froze. Someone coughed. Someone else said, "That's not really our call." He glanced at me like I'd knocked over a glass. "You don't need to worry about that," he said. "Just stick to your task." That was the moment I knew. This wasn't incompetence. It was fear management, and fear-managed systems fail in very specific ways. So I started taking notes more carefully. Not official notes. Those were clean, neutral, unremarkable. The kind that never caused trouble. My real notes lived in the margins, in timing, in patterns, in the way people's voices changed when certain equipment was mentioned, in the delays that were always explained away as normal. At lunch, I ate alone, not because no one invited me, but because I preferred listening. People talk freely when they think you're not important enough to matter. I heard phrases like, "Don't flag that yet." "He hates surprises." "It's easier to just leave it." That last one came up a lot. Easier to leave it. Service teaches you that leaving it is how small problems grow teeth. By the end of the second week, he started trusting me. The wrong kind of trust. The trust you give someone you believe won't challenge you. "Can you handle these reports?" "Just consolidate this. Make it neat." I did. And while I did, I learned. He thought he was keeping me small. What he was actually doing was giving me a front row seat to every weak point in the unit, without ever asking why I noticed them so quickly. And the thing about weak points? They don't announce themselves. They wait. Quietly. Exactly like I was doing. There were questions he never asked. Not once. Not in the first week. Not in the second. Not even after he started stacking more work on my desk, like I was a shelf instead of a person. He never asked where I'd worked before. Never asked why I transferred into a unit that was clearly designed as a pressure cooker for people who couldn't say no. Never asked why my reports were structured differently, tighter, cleaner, with contingencies already folded in, like muscle memory. Most importantly, he never asked how I knew what I knew. If he had, he might have learned about the two conflicts. Not the dramatic kind people like to brag about. No medals, no speeches, no heroic music playing in the background. The kind where everything goes wrong quietly and fast. And the only thing that matters is whether you make the right decision before the window closes. The kind where hesitation costs lives. The first one taught me timing. The second taught me silence. In both, the people who survived weren't the loudest or the highest ranking. They were the ones who noticed what others missed and moved before permission arrived. Afterwards, there were investigations, reports, long rooms with tired eyes reading my words very carefully. Those reports traveled far. He didn't know any of that. To him, my past was irrelevant. Or maybe inconvenient. It's easier to reduce someone when you don't have to confront the version of them that existed before you. He liked to believe I was new, unshaped, that whatever confidence I had would soften with enough routine and mild disrespect. I let him believe it. There's a particular look people get when they think you're harmless. It's not cruel. It's dismissive, like your furniture that might be moved later. He gave me that look often. Once, during a briefing, he interrupted me mid-sentence. "I don't need the background," he said. "Just give me the numbers." I stopped talking. Not because I was embarrassed, but because I recognized the pattern. He wasn't rejecting the information. He was rejecting the possibility that I might know more than he did. After the meeting, someone from the unit pulled me aside. Whispered, actually. "Don't take it personally," he said. "He doesn't like people with history." History. Like it's a stain. I smiled and thanked him, then went back to my desk and rewrote the report anyway. Not for him. For the people who would read it later. The ones who ask different questions. I started to notice how often my emails were forwarded without comment. How requests came back phrased differently than how he'd asked them. How my name was removed from threads and then quietly re-added by someone higher up. None of it was obvious. All of it was telling. Still, he never asked. Not even when he saw the signatures on my documents sometimes came from offices he'd never been invited into. He didn't ask, because asking would mean risking the answer. And answers have consequences. There's a kind of arrogance that doesn't come from confidence, but from insulation. From never having been in a situation where your title stops protecting you, where the only thing that matters is whether you can act under pressure. He'd built his authority on structure. I'd built mine on outcomes. Those two things can coexist until they can't. And the irony? If he had just asked me one honest question, just one, none of what came next would have shocked him. But he didn't. So when the system started to bend, he was still standing there, confident, unprepared, and completely unaware that the person he thought was here for reports had already seen this kind of failure before, twice, and survived it. The incident didn't announce itself. That's the part people who've never been responsible for real systems don't understand. Disasters don't arrive with sirens and dramatic countdowns. They arrive disguised as almost nothing. It was a regular day, midweek, mid-shift, the kind of day where people relax just enough to stop paying attention. I noticed it first because the sound was wrong, not loud, not sharp, just off. A vibration where there shouldn't have been one, like a machine clearing its throat. Then came the smell. Burnt plastic has a way of bypassing logic and going straight to instinct. It hit the back of my throat and pulled something tight in my chest before my brain even caught up. I looked around. Most people didn't react. A few frowned. One guy glanced at a monitor, shrugged, and went back to typing. Someone joked about old wiring and laughed too loudly. He was standing near the main console, arms crossed, watching numbers scroll by like they were entertainment. I stood up. "Did anyone log the fluctuation in Sector 3? I asked, keeping my voice neutral. He turned to me, irritated. "We're in the middle of processing. Don't interrupt unless it's important." There it was again. That assumption. That my concern was theoretical, academic, inconvenient. The vibration deepened, just slightly. Then a sharp click. And then silence. Not the calm kind. The wrong kind. Screens froze. The hum died. Even the air felt like it had stopped moving. People looked up all at once, like prey sensing a shadow. Someone said, "Is that normal?" He didn't answer. He was staring at the console, fingers hovering uselessly above controls he clearly didn't understand beyond procedure. This wasn't in his script. This wasn't a situation he could talk his way through. "Restart protocol?" someone suggested. "Wait," he said quickly. "Don't touch anything." That's when panic started creeping in. Not loud, not yet, but leaking through the cracks. People shifting in their seats, eyes darting, hands trembling just enough to be noticeable if you knew what to look for. I knew. I'd seen this pause before. That dangerous moment where everyone waits for authority while the problem quietly escalates. I checked the readings again. The pattern was wrong. Not a failure yet. A cascade about to start. If we waited another minute, containment would be theoretical. He was still frozen. I didn't look at him. I took one step forward. "Cut auxiliary power to Sector 3, I said. "Now." Someone hesitated. He opened his mouth. "Reroute cooling to manual," I continued. "Override safety delay. You, log the timestamp. You, isolate the feed." The words came out calm, clipped, almost boring. That's what made people listen. They moved before he could stop them. "Who authorized this?" he snapped, but his voice cracked halfway through the sentence. I didn't answer. There wasn't time for explanations. And there definitely wasn't time for ego. Another warning tone sounded, then stopped abruptly as the reroute engaged. 7 minutes. That's how long it took. 7 minutes of controlled motion in a room that had been seconds away from chaos. No shouting, no heroics, just action, sequence, verification. When the system stabilized, no one cheered. They just exhaled, hard. Someone laughed nervously. Someone else sat down on the floor like their legs had finally remembered gravity. I checked the final readings. Stable. Ugly, but stable. Only then did I look at him. He was pale, not angry, not yet, shaken. The kind of shaken that comes from realizing your authority didn't save anyone, and someone you'd dismissed did. Later, in the report, the incident would be labeled minor, a near miss, a handled irregularity. That's how these things always look on paper. But in the room, in that moment of silence before everything tipped, we all knew the truth. Titles didn't stop the failure. Decisions did. And the worst part for him? He hadn't made a single one. What people remember later is never the moment itself. They remember the result. The lights staying on, the system stabilizing, the word incident downgraded to irregularity. They remember that nothing exploded, no alarms screamed, no external reports were triggered. What they don't remember, unless they've lived it, is the moment right before action takes over. That thin slice of time where fear hasn't decided what form it's going to take yet. That's where I stepped forward. I didn't announce myself. I didn't clear my throat or ask permission. I didn't even raise my voice. I just moved. One step out of the line I'd been standing in, one step closer to the console everyone else suddenly seemed afraid of. I could feel eyes on me, sharp and uncertain. There's a strange clarity that comes back in moments like that. My hands stopped shaking. They hadn't been shaking much, but they stopped entirely. My thoughts narrowed. The room got quieter in my head, even though it was full of people. "Listen carefully," I said, not loud, but precise. "If you do this out of order, we'll lose the buffer." No one argued. That was the first surprise. The second was how quickly they followed. Someone cut power exactly where I said. Someone else rerouted the system without double-checking with him, something I knew they'd never have done 5 minutes earlier. Another person started logging actions without being told twice. I wasn't their superior. I was simply the only person speaking in verbs instead of titles. He stood off to the side, watching. I could feel his presence without looking at him, rigid, offended, uncertain where to place himself now that the room wasn't waiting for him anymore. At one point, he tried to intervene. "That's not procedure," he said. I didn't turn around. "Procedure assumes stability," I replied. "We don't have that." There was a pause. Then the system responded. Pressure dropping, load redistributing, the warning light flickering and going dark. The pause stretched just long enough for him to realize that stopping me now would mean actively choosing risk over outcome. He said nothing after that. 7 minutes is not a long time. But in those 7 minutes, something shifted. People stopped looking at him for approval. They looked at me for confirmation. A nod, a raised finger, a short "now." Nothing dramatic, nothing emotional. Just competence, delivered calmly. When it was over, I stepped back into my original place. No victory stance, no commentary. I closed my notebook and sat down like this had been a routine drill instead of the first real test the unit had faced. That, too, was deliberate. You don't assert authority by clinging to the spotlight. You assert it by letting the work speak and then getting out of the way. For a few seconds, no one moved. Then breath returned to the room all at once. Someone muttered, "Holy shit." Someone else laughed, too high-pitched. Another person rubbed their face like they'd just woken up from a nightmare they didn't want to describe. He finally approached me, slowly, carefully, like someone walking up to an unfamiliar animal. "You should have waited," he said. His voice was level, but his jaw was tight. "You don't have the authority to issue commands like that." I looked at him then. Really looked. Not with anger, not with defiance, with something closer to assessment. "Authority didn't stabilize the system," I said quietly. "Actions did." That was the wrong thing to say. I knew it the moment it left my mouth. His face hardened, not explosive, not loud, but controlled in that way people get when they're embarrassed in front of witnesses and don't know where to put it yet. "We'll discuss this later," he said. "In private." I nodded. Not in agreement. In acknowledgement. Because I knew something he didn't yet. Later, conversations are only dangerous if you're unprepared. And I already had the report half written in my head. The kind of report that doesn't accuse. It just records. And records have a way of traveling far beyond the room where they're written. The adrenaline wears off faster than people think. One moment, your body is running on precision and instinct. And the next, you're sitting at your desk. Hands steady. Heartbeat normal. Like nothing happened at all. That contrast messes with people. It makes them want explanations, blame, release. I didn't give any of that. I finished my notes calmly, time-stamped everything, cross-checked logs, attached system data before anyone could clean it up. My fingers moved automatically, trained by long nights where accuracy mattered more than rest. Around me, the unit buzzed in low tones. No one raised their voice, but everyone was talking. Not about the system, not really. About him. About the way he'd frozen. About the fact that someone from reports had stepped in and the world hadn't ended. He waited almost an hour before coming to my desk. That alone told me a lot. People who are confident confront immediately. People who are trying to regain control need time to decide which version of the story they're going to tell themselves. He stood there with his hands behind his back, posture straight, expression carefully neutral. Too neutral. "Come with me," he said. "We need to talk." Not can we, not please, need. I saved my file before standing up, slowly, made sure he saw it. His office was glass-walled, symbolic transparency that fooled no one. You could see everything inside, but soundproofing made sure no one heard a word. He closed the door with unnecessary care. For a moment, he didn't speak. He paced once, then leaned against his desk like this was a casual conversation between equals. "You exceeded your authority today," he said finally. "That kind of behavior creates chaos." Chaos. I almost laughed. Instead, I handed him the printed report. Not a report. The report. It had the full incident timeline, system readings, decision points, and outcome analysis. No opinions, no emotional language, just facts, laid out cleanly and professionally. On the last page were signatures, not his. He frowned and started reading, fast at first, then slower. His eyes snagged on the headers, the distribution list, the reference numbers. I watched the moment he realized this hadn't been written for him. "Why was this sent already?" he asked too quickly. "It wasn't sent," I said. "It was logged." There's a difference, and he knew it. "Who authorized?" "The protocol did," I replied. "The same one you quoted earlier. Section 7, Incident Escalation." He stopped pacing. Actually stopped. That's when he saw the signatures properly, above his level. Offices he only mentioned in careful hypotheticals. Names that didn't appear in his calendar unless something had gone very wrong. His jaw tightened. "You should have informed me first," he said. "If I had," I answered evenly, "the system wouldn't be stable." Silence filled the room. Heavy. Uncomfortable. He straightened up, authority snapping back into place like armor. "This isn't over," he said. "You may think you did the right thing, but stepping out of line has consequences." I nodded again. Same nod as before. Acknowledgement, not fear. "I understand," I said. And I did, just not in the way he meant. When I left his office, the unit went quiet again. People watched me out of the corners of their eyes, waiting to see if I'd been reprimanded, reassigned, erased. None of that happened. Instead, an email notification chimed on my screen less than 10 minutes later. Meeting request. From above him. Subject line. Incident review. No emojis. No exclamation points. No warmth. The kind of meeting you don't get invited to by accident. I didn't look at him when I accepted it. I didn't need to. I could feel it. The shift. The sudden awareness creeping in. The realization that whatever role he'd assigned me in his head didn't match reality anymore. That night, I went home exhausted in a quiet way. Not shaken, not proud, just resolved. Because humiliation doesn't always come from shouting or insults. Sometimes it comes from watching the story you were telling yourself fall apart, line by line, in someone else's report. And I had a feeling this was only the beginning. The phrase sounds harmless if you've never lived inside systems like this. For a talk, not a meeting, not a hearing, not an investigation, just a talk. That's what people say when they want to pretend power is still informal, still flexible, still theirs to manage. He was called in first. I know because I saw him leave. He didn't grab his notebook, didn't straighten his jacket like he usually did before meetings. He just stood up abruptly when the notification hit his screen and walked out, jaw tight, eyes fixed forward like he was bracing against weather. The unit went silent again. This silence was different from the one during the incident. That one had been sharp, electric. This one was heavy, speculative. People weren't afraid of failure now. They were afraid of consequences. Someone whispered, "Is he in trouble?" Someone else murmured, "No, he'll be fine. He always is." I kept working, not performatively, not stubbornly, just normally. That unsettled people more than panic would have. 23 minutes later, my screen chimed. "Please come up. Conference room B, no sender name, no greeting." I stood up, grabbed nothing, and walked out. Conference room B was smaller than the main one. No long table, no audience. Just 4 chairs, a screen on the wall, and a window that looked out over the city in a way that reminded you how small this room really was. 2 people were already there, both higher than him, both reading my report. They looked up when I entered, not surprised, not suspicious, assessing. "Sit," one of them said. I did. They didn't ask me to explain myself, that was the first difference. Instead, the woman on the left asked, "Why did you know what to do?" Not how, not who trained you. Why? I answered honestly, briefly. Because I've seen this failure pattern before. The man on the right nodded and asked, "Why did people listen to you?" I didn't pretend humility. Because I spoke in actions, not rank. They exchanged a look, not approval, not concern, recognition. Then came the question I knew was coming. "Why do your reports carry more weight than his orders?" I paused, not because I was afraid, because this was the moment where saying too much would be a mistake. "Because they're written for outcomes," I said finally, "not appearances." Silence again. But this one felt deliberate. They asked a few more questions about timing, about decision thresholds, about why I didn't escalate verbally first. Each answer was short, factual, emotionless. When it was over, the woman closed the folder and said, "You can go." That was it. No praise, no warning, no reassurance, just dismissal. I left the room and nearly collided with him in the hallway. Up close, he looked worse, not furious, not humiliated yet, unsteady. His eyes flicked to my face, then away, like he was afraid he'd see something there he wasn't ready to process. "They asked you too," he said. Not a question. "Yes," I replied. He swallowed. "What did you tell them?" "The truth." That word landed hard. For the first time since I'd met him, he didn't talk down to me, didn't posture, didn't correct. Instead, he said quietly, "You should have told me who you were." I looked at him, really looked this time. "You never asked," I said. That was the moment his expression changed. Not anger, not defensiveness, understanding, the kind that arrives too late to be useful. We stood there for a second longer than necessary. 2 people in the same hallway, occupying very different realities. Then he straightened his shoulders, instinct, habit, and said, "This isn't finished." I nodded, because he was right, but not in the way he thought. When I returned to the unit, no one spoke to me directly, but I felt it. The shift in posture, The recalibration. People looked at me differently now. Not with fear, with curiosity, with respect, with something close to relief. They'd seen someone survive the talk, and that meant the rules they thought were fixed weren't. I sat down at my desk and opened a new document, untitled, because whatever came next wouldn't be written as a reaction. It would be written as a continuation. And somewhere above us, decisions were already being drafted, quietly, efficiently, without drama. Just like the orders I'd given. Just like the reports I'd always written. The order didn't arrive with ceremony. No announcement. No meeting where someone pretended this was about growth or alignment. Just a system notification that popped up on my screen while I was halfway through reviewing logs that should have been reviewed weeks ago. Temporary responsibility for Section C, effective immediately. Temporary. That word does a lot of work in organizations like this. It soothes egos. It delays panic. It lets people pretend nothing fundamental has changed, yet. I read it once, then again. Then I noticed who wasn't copied. Him. I didn't look up right away. I didn't want to give the moment more weight than it deserved. Authority that needs to be performed is fragile. Authority that's simply applied tends to last longer. 5 minutes passed before he came over, not storming, not confident, measured. "I assume you've seen it," he said. "Yes," I replied. He hesitated, then gestured vaguely toward the screen. Temporary. I met his eyes for the first time without neutrality cushioning the look. "Everything starts that way," I said. That landed harder than I intended. Or maybe exactly as hard as it needed to. He nodded once, sharp, like someone swallowing a pill without water. "So," he said, "what does this mean for the unit?" It was the first real question he'd asked me since I arrived. Not an order, not a correction, a question. "That depends," I said calmly, "on whether you want it to function or just look like it does." His jaw tightened again, but he didn't snap back. That was new. "I'm still in charge," he said. "Yes," I agreed. "Of outcomes above this section." Another pause. Then quietly, "And of you?" I considered that. Words matter. Timing matters more. "I report up," I said. "Not around." That distinction mattered too. He exhaled slowly. Not relief. Adjustment. From that moment on, things changed. Not dramatically, not loudly, but unmistakably. People started coming to me with questions they'd been sitting on for months. Not complaints, concerns, gaps, risks they'd learned to live with because raising them had never gone well before. I didn't promise fixes. I promised review. And then I followed through. I instituted checks before actions instead of explanations after failures. Required logs that couldn't be copied forward. Forced uncomfortable conversations into daylight where they belonged. No punishments, no speeches, just structure. He watched all of it from a careful distance. Sometimes he corrected people automatically, then stopped himself halfway through. Sometimes he hovered, unsure whether to intervene or step back. Once, during a briefing, someone looked to him for approval before answering me. He said nothing, just nodded toward me. That was the moment I realized something important. He wasn't being generous. He was being cautious. Because now he knew, truly knew, that whatever version of me he'd created in his head was wrong. And people who build authority on being right all the time don't handle that realization well. Temporary responsibility has a way of becoming permanent when nothing breaks. And nothing broke. Metrics improved, incidents dropped. The unit stopped holding its breath every time a system hiccuped. People stood straighter, spoke clearer, made decisions without flinching. At the end of the week, another message came in. No subject line, just a calendar block. Extended. Still no comments. Still no apologies. Just quiet confirmation. He passed my desk later that day and said, almost to himself, "I should have paid attention sooner." I didn't answer. Because this wasn't about teaching him a lesson. It was about proving, consistently, relentlessly, that competence doesn't need permission, and that some people aren't here for coffee and reports. They're here because when things fail, someone has to step forward, even if no one asked them to. Power doesn't announce itself when it settles in. It just rearranges the room. I didn't make speeches. I didn't call meetings to explain my vision. I didn't remind anyone that I was now responsible for Section C, even temporarily. Titles are loud, systems are quiet. I focused on the latter. The first rule I introduced wasn't written anywhere. If something feels wrong, we stop. Not escalate, not explain. Stop. That alone took people a while to absorb. You could see it in their posture. The hesitation before raising a hand, the instinct to apologize for wasting time, the way they'd brace themselves before pointing out a potential issue like they expected to be punished for noticing. Every time it happened, I did the same thing. I thanked them. Not theatrically, not warmly, just plainly. Good catch. Glad you said something. We'll look at it. It changed people faster than authority ever could. The second rule was written: checks before action, reports before explanations. No more retroactive justifications. No more creative wording after something went wrong. If you didn't check it beforehand, that was the issue, not the outcome. Some people resisted at first. Old habits don't die quietly. They sulk. They try to prove you wrong by following the letter of the rule while violating its spirit. I let that play out. Systems have a way of exposing bad faith on their own. Within days, the tone of the unit shifted. Conversations became shorter, sharper, less defensive, less theatrical. People stopped narrating their work like they were on trial and started just doing it. And then there was the coffee. I didn't ban it. I didn't joke about it either. I just removed it from the list of tasks. Someone asked, half laughing, "So, coffee's optional now?" "Yes," I said. "Always was." That laugh died quickly, because they realized what I'd actually done. I'd removed the ritual of submission. He noticed. Of course he did. At first, he tried to reassert himself in small ways, clarifying instructions that didn't need clarification, lingering near discussions like his presence alone might tilt them back toward him. But something had shifted too far for that. People didn't look to him automatically anymore. They looked to the process. And the process didn't care who'd designed the org chart. Once, during a review, he interrupted one of my analysts mid-sentence. "That's not relevant," he said. I waited. The analyst froze. Old reflex. I looked at him instead of her. "Let her finish," I said. Not sharply, not confrontationally, just as a fact. He opened his mouth, closed it, then nodded. "Go on," he said to her. She finished. She was right. That correction stayed on record. Later that day, he came to my desk. "You're changing how people behave," he said. "Yes," I replied. "That wasn't your assignment." "No," I agreed. "But it's the effect." He leaned against the edge of my desk, lowered his voice. "You're making me look irrelevant." There it was. Not anger, not accusation, fear. I met his gaze steadily. "I'm making the unit functional," I said. "What that does to anyone's image isn't something I can prioritize." For a long moment, he didn't respond. Then he straightened and said, "You're careful." "I have to be." He nodded slowly. "I underestimated you." I didn't correct him, because the truth was worse. He hadn't underestimated me. He'd misclassified me. By the end of the month, people stopped asking whether my responsibility was temporary. They asked what would happen next quarter, who would be assigned where, whether these rules would expand. Above us, metrics spoke more clearly than opinions ever could. Below us, the unit stopped whispering. Humiliation works by making people small. I hadn't reversed that by being louder or crueler. I'd reversed it by refusing to participate. And the quiet horror for the people who'd dismissed me? They were starting to realize this wasn't a phase. This was a correction, one they couldn't roll back without explaining why things had been broken in the first place. And explanations, once demanded, don't stop asking questions. People think acceptance is quiet, like you wake up one morning and everything just settles. Like there's a soft landing, a deep breath, a gentle understanding that this is how things are now. That's not how it happened for me. Acceptance came in fragments, in irritation, in exhaustion, in the dull ache that followed days where nothing dramatic happened, and yet everything had changed. It started the evening I realized I wasn't angry anymore. I was sitting on my kitchen floor, back against the cabinet, still in work clothes, boots kicked off like I'd dropped them mid-thought. The apartment was silent except for the hum of the refrigerator. I hadn't even turned the lights on. And suddenly, it hit me. My jaw wasn't clenched. For weeks, maybe months, my body had been braced without my permission, like it didn't trust the world not to swing again. That's what humiliation does. It teaches your muscles to expect impact even when nothing is moving. But that night, my shoulders dropped. Not because I'd won, not because he'd backed off, not even because the unit was running smoothly. Because I understood something I hadn't before. What happened to me wasn't personal. It never was. Before service, they'd tried to make me small because I was young, quiet, and inconveniently competent. After service, they tried again. This time because my presence disrupted a story they needed to tell themselves. That authority comes from rank. That survival is luck. That experience only counts if it looks familiar. His words, "You're here for coffee and reports," weren't about me. They were about control. That realization didn't erase the humiliation, but it changed its weight. It stopped living inside my chest and started sitting somewhere external, like an object I could finally look at instead of carry. The next day at work, nothing special happened. No confrontations, no passive-aggressive comments, no dramatic power plays. That was new too. He still watched me, still recalculated, still measured his words more carefully than before. But the edge was gone. Not respect, not fully, but resignation. People came to me with work, real work, not favors, not emotional unloading, just responsibility, cleanly handed over, and I took it. Not as revenge, not as validation, as practice. That's when acceptance finally settled in. Not the soft kind, the solid kind. The kind where you stop asking, "Why did this happen to me?" and start asking, "What do I do with what I've learned?" I accepted that humiliation doesn't always come from enemies. Sometimes it comes from systems that reward blindness and punish clarity. Sometimes it comes from people who are afraid of being exposed as unprepared. I accepted that my strength didn't need to be announced, defended, or explained. And I accepted something else too, something harder, that I didn't need to leave. For a while, I'd assumed the only healthy outcome was distance. New city, new unit, new start. That staying meant tolerating disrespect. But I realized that wasn't true. Staying, on my terms, was also an option. Because the moment humiliation stops defining your position, it loses its power. He thought breaking me would restore order. Instead, it forced a correction. And corrections don't apologize. They just align things back to reality. That night, I finally unpacked the last box from my transfer, the one I'd been avoiding. Inside were old service notes, folded maps, a notebook with names I hadn't said out loud in years. I didn't reread them. I closed the box and slid it under the bed. Not because I was ashamed, because I didn't need to prove anything anymore, to them or to myself. Acceptance isn't about forgetting what happened. It's about understanding that it didn't get to decide who you became. And by then, that part was already done. I didn't get a dramatic ending. No apology in front of the unit. No speech where someone admitted they were wrong. No satisfying moment where humiliation was named and condemned out loud. And that used to bother me. For a long time, I thought closure required witnesses. That justice needed an audience. That if no one said what happened, then maybe it didn't fully count. That's another lie humiliation teaches you. The real ending came quietly, the day I realized no one could talk to me the way he did on that first morning anymore. Not because I'd demanded respect, not because I'd threatened consequences, but because the system itself no longer supported that behavior. He still works there. People always ask that part, like they're hoping for blood. Yes, he stayed. Not because he won, not because nothing changed, because institutions rarely remove people for humiliation. They remove them for measurable failure. And once the unit stabilized, once outcomes improved, once oversight increased, his role shrank naturally. He became careful. Careful with words. Careful with assumptions. Careful with who he underestimated. That's not redemption. That's containment. As for me, I stayed longer than I expected. Long enough to make sure the rules weren't tied to my presence alone. Long enough to see people who used to flinch start correcting each other without fear. Long enough to know that if I left tomorrow, the unit wouldn't collapse back into silence. That mattered more than revenge ever could. Here's what I learned, and what I wish someone had told me after service, when I still thought strength had to look aggressive to count. Humiliation thrives in ambiguity. Clarity starves it. People who try to reduce you don't need to believe you're weak. They just need others to believe it's plausible. You don't fight that by shouting. You fight it by being unavoidable, by documenting, by acting when it matters, by letting outcomes speak in rooms you're not even in. And here's the hardest truth. Sometimes the people who humiliate you aren't monsters. They're afraid. Afraid that if they acknowledge what you bring, they'll have to confront what they lack. Afraid that your competence will expose the fragility of their authority. Afraid that the system they mastered isn't the same one that keeps people alive under pressure. That fear doesn't excuse them, but understanding it keeps you from internalizing their behavior as a verdict on your worth. If you're reading this after service, after coming back, changed, while the world expects you to fit into old boxes, listen carefully. You don't owe anyone your story up front. You don't owe anyone proof before they treat you with basic respect. And you don't have to leave every place that fails you immediately. Sometimes, the strongest thing you can do is stay long enough to correct what tried to erase you. And sometimes the strongest thing is leaving before bitterness teaches you the wrong lessons. Both are valid. What isn't required? Shrinking. Explaining yourself to people who never asked honestly. Accepting humiliation as the price of peace. I learned that strength after service doesn't look like endurance anymore. It looks like discernment. Knowing when to step forward. Knowing when to stay silent. Knowing when to document instead of react. Knowing that your calm isn't weakness, it's control. They thought I was there for coffee and reports. In a way, I was. But what I really brought with me was something they didn't recognize until it was too late to dismiss. The ability to act when things fail. The discipline to speak without emotion. And the patience to let systems reveal the truth on my behalf. If someone tries to humiliate you after service, remember this. They're reacting to what you survived. You don't need to relive it for their comfort. Just keep going, quietly, precisely, and let the record show who you really are.